You guys have asked repeatedly for a video on what weeds you could leave in your garden and why. So weeds could technically be broken into 4 categories if we were to look at them from a beneficial perspective. Category 1 would actually be helping to solubilize or mobilize or fix actual nutrients. Number 2 would actually be for ground cover to prevent against erosion or just heating of the soil. Moisture retention would be number 2. Number 3 would actually be to attract pollinators to our garden via their flowers. And number 4 would be soil conditioning. So in some way it's aggregating, breaking up of soil compounds, maybe releasing very specific exudates, bringing in microbes, that sort of thing. So let's look at where our weeds fall into with these 4 categories. One thing I will say is that regardless of where you are, there are 2 categories of weeds that you should keep in mind when listening to this video. And if any of the ones I'm mentioning fall into this category in your region, then ignore everything I said about its benefits and actually remove it. It's very important. The first one being invasive weeds. Invasive weeds are weeds that are not native to your region and therefore should be plucked and destroyed accordingly. And the second one is noxious weeds. Now, noxious weeds technically means potentially harmful to the public. Now, things like thistle fall into this category, and yes, thistle can attract in pollinators, but they are considered a noxious weed because of their thorny spikes and their insidious nature, in which they don't just propagate through the flower, but through the roots as well. So just keep that in mind when I say the name of the weed. If you're thinking to yourself, I have that weed, I want to keep it, actually do a Google to make sure it's not noxious or invasive in your area, because if it is, my expectation of you is that you would give it a yank. Before we get started, hit that subscribe button if you want to learn how to garden with science and join this awesome crew where the comment section is usually smarter than me. Now, this is one weed that I have all over my garden, in particular in my tomato beds, as well as in this kitchen garden bed here behind me, and it looks like this. It's pretty simple. It does flower and pollinators are attracted to it. It's also edible and it provides ground cover. The one thing that I would argue is probably not the case is that some do claim it mobilizes both potassium and phosphorus. I haven't found any scientific literature to actually back that up. It's just something that I saw really commonly on the internet, which was a little weird, but it is one of the claims. Again, not something that I think is, particularly true in this case, but ground cover and pollinators, absolutely. In particular, ground cover, I do really enjoy it. Another one I have in my garden quite often, and I can't seem to find it right now, is actually plantain. So plantain is one of those plants similar to that of clover, where it sits nice and close to the soil surface, so it's not competing for things like light. And ultimately it is a ground cover specific. It is edible, meaning you can eat it, and it doesn't do anything nutrient mobilization wise, soil structure conditioning wise, not that either, but ground cover as a living mulch, it is a great additive. It also is not very invasive, meaning it doesn't really take off in the garden. It's really easy to control actually. Chickweed on the other hand is very difficult to control, I personally find. Regardless of what you put it through, it seems to survive everything. So keep that in mind if you're looking for something that's a little bit lower maintenance that would provide a ground cover. Plantain is a great idea. If you want a living mulch that's very explosive in growth, then go with the chickweed. If you're going to direct sow in the garden, meaning directly seed your seeds, I would stick with the plantain, keeping the plantain around, but I would not keep the chickweed around. That would have to be solely dedicated to a garden bed where you intend to use transplants, which is exactly what I'm using it for here with my tomatoes. Lamb's quarters is another one that is edible, and this one in particular, while edible, has a very deep root system. Now, this deep root system will help with the mobilization of nutrients. It doesn't have a particularly high affinity for one nutrient or the other. It is just a universal capture of both macro, secondary macro, and micronutrients within that plant. And the idea here is that because those roots dig deep, they'll take nutrients from farther down in our soil profile where our plant roots cannot necessarily get to, pull it up into the plant biomass, the upper biomass that we then would look at and eat and deal with. And when we go to compost or chop and drop it in our garden and that plant begins to decompose, that nutrients that it brought up from the bottom to build that upper biomass can then be used to provide nutrients to the plant via decomposition and mineralization and mobilization on that soil surface. So this is a great one if you're looking to get that soil nutrients from below your natural root environment. Okay, next one is actually clover and vetch. These two are both nitrogen fixing. They come in so many different ranges, whether it's purple prairie clover or white Dutch clover, you name it. These are incredibly blanketing. They have flowers that obviously attract pollinators, but they nitrogen fix, meaning they pull nitrogen from our atmosphere and into our soil, which will ultimately be utilized by your plants, not in that year in which you planted, but in the years to come as the nodules begin to decompose. So vetch and clover are great ones that you can incorporate. Just keep in mind that they're incredibly, again, aggressive in the way that they establish, and therefore using them in a bed that you intend to sow seeds in, maybe not the best choice, but in a bed that you choose to transplant, these will work just fine. Purslane is one that's very similar to chickweed in the sense that it helps to give like an established ground cover, a living ground cover. It is also great in drought environments, so where chickweed's not going to survive, purslane will survive. It's notoriously found in the spaces between sidewalks or in interlacing brick. So it would do really good in a stone garden, a stone perennial garden where you're using stone crops and sedums. And ultimately it doesn't give any real benefit other than being able to aggressively establish an environment where you need ground cover to prevent against the soil erosion. And the last one is the dandelion. So dandelions are known for edibleness nowadays, and so people are really obsessed with keeping them around, but they're actually great at soil conditioning. So I've done videos on this before about the tillage radish, aka the icicle radish, and how it actually is able to aggregate and break up clay soil to allow for proper air and water penetration into that soil system, which will help with microbe decomposition along with healthy root biomass. Well, it turns out dandelions are the free alternative to this because of that taproot. So the idea here is to allow the dandelions to establish, which will bring in pollinators, and over time as that root establishes and grows nice big deep taproot, it will eventually die off, decompose, and that decomposed root lane that has been made will now be utilized for both water to penetrate into that soil system along with air, which will help aid in root biomass health along with the actual decomposition of different materials in that soil system. So for soil conditioner, dandelion is definitely up there. There's obviously other things like milkweed for pollinators, you name it. The list is pretty much endless. So if you guys have any ideas of what your favorite weeds are, whether it's because they're edible or they fall under one of the 4 categories, let me know in the comments down below. Again, your comments aren't just for me, they're for the entire community because everyone wants to learn. So I will see you guys next time.